Your freedom depends on equality, political equality specifically, and that kind of equality depends on democracy. Big concepts, I know, but it's important to understand if we want to protect our freedom. There are people in power who want us to be confused about what is what. So confused that we'll just leave it to them and trust them to fix it all for us. Or so confused that we check out altogether as if there's nothing for us to do about it. But in a democracy, the government is us, and you can't have freedom without democracy. And I'm here to tell you why. Hey, I'm Ahsante, and here's what I've been thinking. All right, let's break this thing down. I'm gonna break it down for you. Okay, so freedom requires equality. Why? Because in order to be free, we don't want to be dominated by anyone else. You're not free if you don't have control over your own life, your own body, your own choices, your own decisions, right? So we all want that individual autonomy. So in order to be free, someone else can't be dominating you. They can't have power over you. They can have power with you. It can be a mutually beneficial relationship, but they can't be dominant. So if they're not dominant, then you all have to be equals. So that is how freedom requires equality. But you might ask, Ahsante, if we're all equal, does that mean that we all are the same? Do we all have to have the same amount of everything to make sure that no one's dominating another person? Because the other thing about freedom is that you do want to be able to do your own thing. So you also don't want an enforced sameness with everyone else around you. But the good news is, equality doesn't mean the same. It's often framed as if it is, but that's really not the case if you think about it. For example, 1 + 1 = 2, but 1 + 1 is an expression. There are 3 symbols there. 2 is a number. They're different. Numbers are different from expressions, but they are equal to each other because they are both valued the same. 1 + 1 is not greater than or less than 2. They have the same value under the laws of mathematics. So those same principles, equal value, equal treatment under the law. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about when I'm talking about equality. It's about the relationship between people, not having 2 people that are absolutely the same in every way. The goal here is non-domination. No one gets to dominate anyone else. That's the thing to keep in mind. Now, democracy comes in because democracy is political equality. There are no kings. No one is above the law. We all have equal treatment under the law. We all have equal rights. There is no person who deserves to be a king over and above everyone else. And there's no dictator that's acceptable because even though a dictator might seem to be benevolent, at any moment they could decide to abuse your rights, abuse their authority, become corrupt. So in a democracy, rather than power to one person or even one group of people like an aristocracy, it's power to the people. That way we all have a say and we all have some sort of control over the rules that govern our lives. So that's why freedom requires democracy. We want to be in control of our government, of the rules that we use to live our lives. We want to have power in our own hands, and we share that power together rather than having that power concentrated in the hands of a few. But that begs the question, if that's what a democracy is, then do we really have one? It certainly feels like a lot of the rules that are controlling our lives are not things that we've had a direct say in. It feels like our representatives don't really represent us, and it certainly feels like there's a lot of power concentrated in the hands of a few. So is the United States a democracy? Well, my answer is yes and no. Democracy is both an ideal, but it's also a spectrum, and I will be drawing that spectrum out in a bit, but essentially, the US has gotten more democratic over time. We haven't reached that ideal of democracy, but along the spectrum of democracy, we have been steadily moving towards the democratic side. The story of America is the story of progressive freedom struggle. We have gotten more and more free and more democratic over time. We did technically have a pre-democratic constitution at the nation's inception, but even within that constitution, we were a republic that was supposed to be a representative republic where those leaders represented the will of the people. This country was still founded on the consent of the governed and on the idea that there are no more kings. The founders obviously didn't have a fully democratic vision. They did allow for slavery after all. you do also have to acknowledge that wanting no more kings to rule over you was completely radical at the time, and it was a step towards democratizing. The ideals that the founders put forth in the Declaration of Independence about humans being created as equals and having individual rights and government only being just if it has the consent of the governed, those are democratic ideals. The execution in the Constitution was not as democratic. The founders had a valid concern. Again, credit where credit is due. If we're not going to have a king that has been trained and prepared for this sort of leadership role, we do need to have virtuous leaders who are responsible, who know what they're doing, and we can't necessarily trust just anyone. We also want power to be in good hands. We need the leaders to be responsible. And the founders were thinking that the government needed to be run by virtuous people. That's the valid concern. The mistake they made was thinking that the only virtuous people were rich white men. Now that matched the thinking at the time, but we now know and have the science that shows that men are not inherently more rational or less emotional than women are. We also know that there's no biological basis to race. There's no virtue or inherent inferiority along racial categories. And as far as wealth signaling virtue, well, rich people are just as capable as the rest of us of making terrible judgment calls. Virtue doesn't map cleanly onto these race, gender, and class categories, but we do need to have widespread public virtue in order for democracy to work. So over time, that has led to more inclusion, things like public education, things like social welfare, so that everyone does have some level of resources so that they're not only thinking in survival mode. Those are the things that are necessary to have a well-functioning democracy. So are we all the way over to the ideal of total political equality? No. While American democracy today is far from perfect, it's important to be able to see the progress, and it's also important not to say that, well, we don't have a perfect system, therefore none of this matters, and it's important that we don't let ourselves go backwards. We have one of our political parties openly advocating for the extreme concentration of power into the hands of a few. We have one of the vice presidential candidates listening to thinkers that actually support monarchy. The founders of this country, flawed though they were, knew that monarchy was not compatible with liberty and justice for all. The idea that we should be ruled by one man and not ruled by the rule of law is un-American. Again, that was the entire founding premise of this country, is that we're not doing kings no more. Sorry, boo. George Washington, our mythic hero, stepped down from office voluntarily and was like, I'm not going to be a king. I meant that, okay? We don't do kings. Period. So if that's not where we want to be, if we don't want to go backwards to pre-American times, then where do we want to be going? Well, this is the part where we really need to map out that full spectrum of democracy to see what the ideal actually would look like. So let's get into this diagram. So on one side is that ideal of a perfect democracy. Ideals are not meant to be perfectly achievable, but they do point us in the right direction. So this ideal is democracy, power to all the people, because again, we're not doing one group getting to dominate all other groups. We have political equality. So all these mean that power is shared equally. On the other hand, you have autocracy. That's power to one person. This is political inequality, and power is hoarded. Now, there's a temptation to view this as a binary, and if you were to split it down the middle, say to yourself, well, if we're more to the democratic side, that means we're a democracy, and either you're a democracy or you're not. That's it. But that is where the confusion happens. That's how we get to be a democracy that doesn't actually feel very democratic. So in my conception of this, and these are, just my thoughts, there's actually a middle ground where no, we're not to the most extremes of autocracy, but we're not really to democracy either. There's this middle area that we need to account for. Oh, I love coloring, I will say. So when you think about us having this middle ground, it becomes a little more clear. One thing that can be a bit confusing is that this middle ground tends to have universal voting. And because universal voting, everyone having the right to vote, is the most basic element of democracy, we tend to call anything with universal voting a democracy. So this entire area winds up being so-called democracy. Even when there's still a lot of elite control of politics, even when there's so much money in politics so that we don't all have our voices heard, the voices of the rich count way more than the voices of those of us who are not rich. All of it can be put into the label of democracy, which can make us seem like, well, this is how it's supposed to be. This is the democratic state. Nothing for us to do, is what it is. But we haven't gotten to the blue. This is the area that I'm calling a congruent democracy. Now, this is my term, so don't be looking this up because you ain't gonna find it. Coining this, if you will. Don't go Googling like congruent democracy. I've never heard of that. I know. Listen, stay with me, stay with me. A congruent democracy is a democracy where the structures of power and the structures of government actually match those ideals, the ideals that are currently in our Declaration of Independence. It's an area where we actually do have power to all people. We are practicing political equality, and we do have a system where power is shared relatively equally. Again, we never get to total perfection, but honestly, anywhere close, much closer to this would be great. So how do we get there? Let's map out what's on this spectrum specifically. Well, the most fundamental part of a democracy, something that would be squarely on the democracy side of the spectrum, is free and fair elections. You have voting, everyone's allowed to vote, no one is stopped from voting, so they're free and they're fair in that all votes are counted, votes count equally. It's not like someone gets 2 votes or can vote twice. That's free and fair elections. And we have this principle, one person, one vote. That basically sums it up. This is foundational because in a democracy, if we have the consent of the governed, then the leaders need to represent the will of the people, and voting is how the people make their voice heard. That's how you know the will of the people. Now, everyone agrees that free and fair elections are the foundational part of a democracy, but different scholars have different frameworks about the entirety of what makes a democracy a democracy. I like the framework put forth in the book 4 Threats, and I will link that book in the show notes in the description if you're curious. So in the book 4 Threats, Lieberman and Mettler's second element of democracy is the rule of law. This contrasts again with the rule of one man. One man's whims can change from day to day, hour to hour, but the law is the law. We've written it down. We're all clear on what the rules are. And it's different from vigilante justice. So it's not everyone taking things into their own hands, because if that were the case, then who knows what the punishments would be? Who knows what kind of reaction you'd get from people? That's not a safe way to do things, and it's very easy to be dominating someone else in that way. So in a democracy, we have a system of laws that's orderly and consequences are very clear. We have a system of justice, and that's how we're governing ourselves. The third element is legitimacy of the opposition. If we're gonna have equal voice, equal votes, equal say in how we're governing ourselves, then you're gonna have a lot of different opinions. And so you need to be able to have disagreements in a healthy way where you're not saying that anyone who disagrees with you is an enemy or a threat or someone who needs to be wiped out. And the fourth element is the integrity of rights. As I say in the book, this is the newest feature of democracies, but it's the idea that we don't only have laws that are on the books, but everyone's individual rights need to be protected under the laws. And those rights are defended and really defined within the courts. So this side is really about preventing domination. We have elections so that everyone has an equal voice and can participate in crafting the rules of laws that we all have to then live by. We follow the same sets of rules for everyone. The opposition is legitimate. I can disagree with you without dominating you or trying to control you or force you into my opinion. And everyone has individual rights that have to be respected no matter what. So these all prevent domination. But just like there can be free and fair elections, there can be elections that are not free and not fair. So on the other side of the line, you have rigged elections. Maybe not everyone is allowed to vote. Maybe some people's votes count more than others. You can also have a situation where there are laws, but the laws are unjust. Maybe they target specific groups, or maybe the laws aren't always applied in an even fashion to every person. You can have a situation where There is opposition, but you desire to crush the opposition. You don't view the opposing party as legitimate. You think of them as an enemy, maybe an enemy from within. And you can have a situation where, yeah, everyone's voting, but people don't have their individual rights respected. So you have a lack of rights. Now, this is a scribbled out whiteboard version of this diagram, so you all can see it as I'm building it up. But if you want a digital copy of this, along with a couple of notes of what we're talking about, then you can grab that at the link in my description. Just put in your email and I'll send it to you. So on this side of the spectrum, in this middle area, you have things that really allow for domination. No, it's not overt structures of oppression, but you're not protecting people from abuse by other parties. If you don't protect against domination and abuse, you're gonna have a situation where a few powerful players can start to control and dominate other people. You get a progressively less free society. So that's why that baseline level of democracy has some level of protection there. Within this middle ground area, you have a situation where no, you're not enforcing inequality, but you're not enforcing equality either. So you can easily go sort of back and forth between this gray area where rights start getting taken away, the opposition starts to be vilified, and people are becoming more and more dominated, and power is becoming more concentrated into the hands of the few. So you can see how America would seem like a democracy that's not that democratic. Yeah, we have some things that are over here, but low-key, high-key, we be over here too. Most obviously, we had one of our constitutional rights stripped away with the Dobbs decision. So that's over here. The Supreme Court said, I brought your rights into this world and I'll take them out. Okay, so do not sleep on the Supreme Court and, you know, who controls that, okay? We've had obviously a lot of unjust laws on the books over time, and we actually do have problems with the election. The party that keeps talking about the rigged election isn't the party that it's actually rigged against. Another important Supreme Court case, Shelby County v. Holder, struck down part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So now states can legally pass discriminatory voting laws. And in a lot of ways, we don't actually have one person, one vote. Another big Supreme Court case was Citizens United, and that ruled that money was speech. Money is voice. So as opposed to one person, one voice, we now have $1, one voice. Doesn't really make sense, because if money is voice, then those with more money have much more voice. They have much more say, they have more power to influence the elections, and that is exactly what we've seen play out. So we not only have money in politics skewing the one voice, one vote principle, we actually have the structure of Congress skewing that as well. The Senate, we have 2 senators for each state, even though the states have dramatically different populations. Wyoming is the least populated state. It has a population of 578,000 people. Those people are represented by 2 senators. The most populated state is California. California has 39 million people, who are also only represented by 2 senators. With those population ratios, a voter in Wyoming has 67 times the power of a voter in California within the Senate. So in the Senate, the principle is one person, up to 67 votes, depending on where you live. Our representation in the House is more proportional, but still unequal. Wyoming has 1 representative, so that's 1 for 578,000 people. California has 52 representatives for 39 million people, so that's 1 representative for 750,000 people. It does not have to be this way. It used to be that the House was reapportioned every 10 years following the census so that things would stay much more balanced. But in 1911, the size of the House was fixed at 435 people. At that time, each representative represented about 211,000 constituents, so much smaller, and it allowed the representatives to be much more representative of the people who they served. And of course, there's the Electoral College, which doesn't represent the will of the people because it's based on that skewed representation within Congress. But unfair elections are better than no elections and no accountability at all, so it's worth mapping out what we've progressed from, what is on that autocracy end of the spectrum. Here we have systems that explicitly create and enforce inequality. At the extreme end, we have complete dictatorship, power totally concentrated in the hands of one man. Let's be real. Then you have kings and monarchy, where power is concentrated within one family. Fascism would be in this zone, and I'm putting it here because there is often a dictatorial leader within fascism, but fascism is really the politics of us against them. There is a master race that is the nation, the true Germans, the true Americans. They're the master race, and they want to have power and control over the structure of society. That social order has a strict gender and racial hierarchy where the race at the bottom is dehumanized and sometimes eliminated altogether. Then we have slavery. It's not a total control of society, but it is emphasizing the dehumanization of whatever race is enslaved. And then you have caste systems where, unlike slavery and fascism, you might not be explicitly dehumanizing the bottom rung of people or forcing them to work in forced labor camps, as happened in slavery and fascism, but there is a set social hierarchy where some people are explicitly on the top and some people are explicitly on the bottom. All of these systems are about creating and perpetuating inequality. They're systems where people do have total control over other people and where some people's humanity is explicitly valued more than other people's humanity. Now, the scariest thing about this present political moment in the US is that the rhetoric of the Republican Party is in this zone right now. Talking about immigrants as vermin, that is the dehumanizing language of fascism. Talking about being a dictator on day one, I mean, that's taking us to even before where the founders were, right? Like, the founders were like somewhere in here. They moved from the monarch to around here and they called themselves sort of making progress, which sure, but to take us back even further into autocracy than that is pretty wild. So even though we are here in this middle ground right now where we don't actually have political equality, I would say we are actually in the oligarchy or potential for oligarchy zone. Oligarchy is rule of the few, and they are typically the wealthy few because you really can't extrapolate financial power from political power. So no, we haven't achieved political equality, rule by all the people. We do have some ways in which the few, the powerful few, are controlling the many. But we're not over here. And we don't want to go over here. And this would make us a much less free country. And only one of the political parties is using this kind of rhetoric right now. Both parties are not the same. Yes, it does suck that we have political systems where money's infiltrated politics across the board. So we are all caught up in this oligarchy section, but some of us are talking about this kind of stuff. It's worth making that distinction so that we know the progress that we need to hold on to while not taking us to a place that was honestly even worse than where the founder started off. This section is typically called authoritarian. Lest you think I'm exaggerating, I want to actually give a definition of fascism. Merriam-Webster defines fascism as a populist political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, that is associated with a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, and that is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation and by forcible suppression of opposition. So that's the general dictionary definition, but I also want to bring in the work of a scholar that studies fascist rhetoric and where it can lead for a living. So this is an excellent read by Jason Stanley, How Fascism Works. Quick read, very readable, highly recommend. I'll just read you his overview from the introduction. And by the way, this is from 2018, so before our current election season. Fascist politics includes many distinct strategies: the mythic past, propaganda, anti-intellectualism, unreality, hierarchy, victimhood, law and order, sexual anxiety, appeals to the heartland, and a dismantling of public welfare and unity. Though a defense of certain elements is legitimate and sometimes warranted, there are times in history when they come together in one party or political movement. These are dangerous moments. In the United States today, Republican politicians employ these strategies with more and more frequency. Their increasing tendency to engage in this politics should give honest conservatives pause. And I'll make the point that I'm not mapping being liberal or conservative neatly onto this spectrum. It doesn't map neatly onto this spectrum. There is a healthy, honest version of conservatism that I do think we need in society. I'll be going more in depth into that in a future video. A healthy conservatism, I think, is one that sees the value in maintaining some larger social structures, that knows that we do need cohesion and social stability, that also sees the value in having moral foundations of a culture and having a safe environment. There's a conservatism that sees those things as just as important as individual freedom. And in fact, I think that those things, when done well, support individual freedom. A productive conservative approach would say, how can we have individual rights and freedoms while also not destroying the culture of society, while also conserving a sense of social cohesion? What we don't want is a conservatism that throws out your individual rights altogether. No rights for you. Not what we want. Undesirable. The issue with the current iteration of the Republican Party is that they are putting forward a platform that would dismantle the federal protections against private and state domination and would put in a system that allows for even more concentration of power into the hands of a few. Not to mention that the Supreme Court basically just made the president into a king by allowing immunity for any actions that are done on the job. Yeah, break the law all you want, just make sure you do it on company time. One of the most dangerous things happening now is the antagonizing of other Americans, fellow citizens. As Stanley says, the most telling symptom of fascist politics is division. It aims to separate a population into an us and a them. When I read this, it gave me much more understanding of what's going on right now. Listen to this. Fascist politicians justify their ideas by breaking down a common sense of history and creating a mythic past to support their vision for the present. They rewrite the population's shared understanding of reality by twisting the language of ideals through propaganda and promoting anti-intellectualism, attacking universities and educational systems that might challenge their ideas. Eventually, with these techniques, fascist politics creates a state of unreality where conspiracy theories and fake news replace reasoned debate. As a common understanding of reality crumbles, fascist politics makes room for dangerous and false beliefs to take root. First, fascist ideology seeks to naturalize group difference, thereby giving an appearance of natural scientific support for a hierarchy of human worth. When social rankings and divisions solidify, fear fills in for understanding between groups. Any progress for a minority group stokes feelings of victimhood among the dominant population. Law and order politics has mass appeal, casting us as lawful citizens and them, by contrast, as lawless criminals whose behavior poses an existential threat to the manhood of the nation. Sexual anxiety is also typical of fascist politics, as the patriarchal hierarchy is threatened by growing gender equity. Okay. Don't say we're exaggerating when we say this is fascism. Like, it's pretty obvious where this is going at this point. It's not good. It's not pretty. Even if your vote is against this more than it is for the other team, it's worth it to vote against this, okay? Okay, so we don't want to go backwards. This has been the direction of progress over time. And it's gone in this direction not because rights were granted out of benevolence to people, but because different classes and groups organized and agitated and fought and defended their rights over time. There are always going to be people who want to concentrate power in their own hands, so there always needs to be this push for progress and more equality. So then what should we be agitating for? Let's get to the part of the spectrum where we're actually creating equality. I like the vision of equality put forth by political philosopher Danielle Allen. She derived 5 points of political equality from looking at the Declaration of Independence. So again, The values that the founders had were strong. It's about perfecting the execution, right? Having a more perfect version of those values actually executed in the structure of society. So here we go. The first element is freedom from domination. So again, freedom, we want to be able to do our own things. We want to have that sort of individual inclination without having a situation where we're dominating other people. So how do we strike that balance? That's the first thing. Because this area is about preventing domination, I'm not going to repeat that here, but that is the first principle. Next is equal access to the instruments of government. So the government has gotten so far removed from the everyday person, and access to government is often financial, right? Donors have access to government, lobbyists have access to government, but you and me as average citizens, we don't have as much access. So equal access to governance mechanisms, having representation, we need that in equal measure. Next is the equal ability to contribute to our shared common knowledge. Danielle Allen calls this epistemic egalitarianism. We make decisions based on what we know to be true. Not only how society is working, but also what are the flaws? Whose voices get to speak up about what's working and not working for them? What we think of as the truth has a huge role to play in how we distribute power. I'm going to have a future video on that. And by the way, if you want to know about when these future videos come out, be sure to subscribe to my email newsletter. I'll send you a little note whenever the next video is up. You can subscribe on YouTube here as well. You just can't always trust the algorithm to deliver you the things you subscribe to, so I would suggest signing up for a quick email note, link in the description. So if you want to hold people in power accountable, we need an accurate sense of what's actually going on across the country, and we should all be able to contribute and participate in that. This also speaks to the issue with the feeling that elites from on high are just telling you what to believe, telling you what's true, telling you that, oh, we already have a democracy, oh, we need to trust these institutions. That's not going to cut it. There needs to be much more of a dialogue and much more interactivity, as well as independent media, community-run outlets, people providing you information who you actually have more of a direct relationship with. Next is reciprocity. This is really about having systems with mutual benefits and a culture of mutual benefit. If there are winners and losers in different policy decisions, as there often are, they're just not the same losers, the same group losing every time. There's a give and a take. There's mutual benefit, so that's reciprocity. And finally, there's co-ownership of the institutions that make up public life. So co-ownership of the apparatus of the state as opposed to those things being in private hands. So for example, private prisons would be completely unacceptable. That's part of the justice system, and that should be something that we all own collectively. So that starts to give you a sense of what a congruent democracy would actually look like. And there's a lot more to explore here. I'm going to be going into this congruent democracy concept a lot more in the future. But these are the kind of things we would need in order to actually create equality. So it's more than just the negative preventing the worst harms. It's how can we create these systems that do value everyone's humanity equally, that create opportunities for actual collaboration and power sharing, as opposed to dividing us up into two teams where it's us versus them and one has power over the other. How can we be in power with each other? If power is shared closer to this side of the spectrum, you have avenues for people to air their grievances. You have ways for us to be understanding each other, having debates and discussion and certainly conflict, but that conflict has ways of being resolved and resolved in a productive manner that creates new institutions, creates new opportunities, creates new ways of working together. So this is the area where you get relative peace. That's part of why we've had peacetime for so long here in the US, is we have been moving in this direction of more and more rights and more ways for all of us to be included. If you have exclusion from rights, if you have certain people that are restricted from liberty and the pursuit of happiness, they're going to push back against those conditions. And so on this side, you have conditions that are more conducive to war, to conflicts that can't be resolved peacefully, that can only be resolved by violence because you have violent repression happening. Even if you have very powerful rulers that are dictators or kings, the king can never sleep easy because he has to keep other people down by force. Like, people will naturally want their freedom, so they have to be kept down by force. So you're never off your guard. You're always sort of at war with the people that you're oppressing. And if you're the only person in a position where you get to control your circumstances because control is vested in one single person, well, other people are probably looking for your job. You know, they probably want to take you out. You know, you probably got to watch your back. As Shakespeare said, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. So even if an authoritarian has short-term success, they're not going to be able to rest easy. They will never actually get to a place of true peace. And other people rightfully see these sorts of characters as threats. So even if they're not being threatened directly, they want to dismantle these sorts of systems. That's why we've had Civil War. That's why we've had, World War II. These sorts of people were perpetrating their schemes, and it was rightfully seen as a threat to freedom and rights and liberty and happiness as a whole. So this is just not a recipe for like social harmony. In order to avoid uprisings or resolve them when they happen, authoritarian leaders have typically had to yield. The best way to avoid uprisings, to avoid social upheaval, is to grant people rights so that they do not want to overthrow your oppressive system. Moving in this direction is how you can get voluntary, peaceful cooperation with the people around you, and we all depend on others in order to get to the things that we really want, both materially and socially, emotionally, like we're social creatures. That's how we're really going to get to this place of peace and general shared prosperity. This is also why peace isn't actually neutral. Peace requires a commitment to sharing power, to shared prosperity, to rights across the board for all people. I feel like we have a moral obligation to press for this side of the spectrum. Like, I do think that these are the right ideals in this democracy, power to all people, political equality. And the thing is, the science and the history points to that as well. There is no biological basis for an inequality of human worth. There's no science to support that. And so you would see movements on this side go anti-intellectual, anti-science. The history demonstrates that when you have rhetoric that belittles and antagonizes and dehumanizes folks, you get to mass casualties, mass suffering. The history shows us that, and so people who want to go in that direction would be likely to want to suppress that history. So peace is not neutral. It does mean that we need to be moving in a particular direction, and it does mean rejecting these false ideologies that aren't supported by history or science, ideologies that are disturbingly becoming a bit more popular and that have led us to pretty terrible places. This is part of why we need to be clear about our values and ideals. We need to know what democracy really means and what it should look like so that we are moving ourselves in the right direction. Democracy is the direction that I believe we should be moving in, and it's what I'll be continuing to discuss on this channel. But ultimately, you get to make up your own mind. Think about it. Thank you so much to New America for providing the seed funding so that I could launch this brand new channel, Bean Thinking. I am so grateful for their support. They supported a year of developing this and working on scripts and rough cuts and costumes. I have more artistic videos in the works. Thank you also to the Brilliant Beans community on Patreon for having my back as I've been working through this for the past little while. And thank you so much for watching. Remember to think critically and creatively, and I will see you next time.